Hey there, it's Matt Steen with another chemistry conversation. So, a lot of conversations I've been having lately are about what do we do with our team's salaries in the midst of all this inflation. And so I've heard of denominations setting minimum increases for teams. I heard one denomination set it at like 5.3%. I've heard a lot of churches and executive pastors talking about having an 8% cost of living adjustment at the end of the year, others at 4%. And I've heard some that are just saying, hey, we have to reduce salary this year. We don't have the ability to do this. And so I thought this was a good time to kind of come back and revisit some of how we approach salaries here at Chemistry. So we don't necessarily go in and say, hey, it needs to be this much, it needs to be that much. What we do is we tell churches you need to be as generous as you possibly can, while at the same time being a good steward of what God's entrusted us with. Okay. Now, some people may say, hey, that's consultant speak and you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. And yes, I am. I am. And so you are welcome. But what we say when we do this is you do need to be as generous as you possibly can with your staff team. But you also understand that this is a finite resource. And so there's some principles that we put into that we encourage churches to lean into as they're setting salaries. And we encourage them to set salaries knowing that there are people in your church that understand what it costs to live where you are, what it costs to live with families, with kids where you are, and to kind of tap in on them. There's other resources like datausa.io, which is a great resource that Deloitte puts out. Churchsalary.com is a great resource. And then your local school system should be more than willing to share their pay scale with you, because that's all public knowledge. So I would lean into those as things that kind of help you understand what are fair and what's livable. Tap into some of the people in your congregation that'd be willing to kind of share, what it's like to live with kids and family and all that, but then kind of tap into some of these principles. The first one is this: we want our pastors to be able to model generosity as much as they can. Okay. What do I mean by model generosity? Every Girl Scout in the entire church is going to hit up the pastor with a box of Samoas at some point. Okay. Every kid that's going on a mission trip at some point is going to come up to the pastor and say, hey, will you sponsor me on this mission trip? Every Boy Scout is selling popcorn. You kind of get where I'm going here. You may get into a building project and want the pastor to be able to lead the way in giving to this. And so one of the things that we try not to do is get to a point where when you set a salary for a pastor where they're going to have to choose between being generous with what God's given them or paying for groceries that week. What we're trying to do is prevent the fights and the harsh conversations between husband and wife when they say, hey, you bought a $5 box of cookies and we really needed that for a gallon of milk. And so keep in mind that one of the things that you want to have happen is you want your pastor to be able to give generously to the kingdom, to your church, and to other entities. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing is you want your pastor, you want your staff to be able to live in the neighborhoods that you're ministering to. Okay, so what does it cost for a pastor with 2 kids to live in a neighborhood where most kids are in rec league soccer or play lacrosse or whatever? Are you paying them enough to be able to make sure that they're able to afford rent in the area or a house payment in the area that you live in? Are they going to be able to afford to get their kids into soccer or whatever else? You want to be able to allow them to live in the area that you're in. One church that I looked at years ago as a youth pastor, they shared with me the pay package and all that kind of stuff, and I looked at it and I had done my homework and I said, I can't live in this neighborhood on this. And they all looked at me and said, well, yeah, we know. But if you move 45 minutes or an hour away, there's a lot of places where you could afford to be. And I had to ask them if they were okay with their youth pastor being an hour away in case somebody went into crisis, or if somebody was having a spiritual emergency and needed me right away, or if something was going on in the church. So ultimately, you know how that conversation goes, but you want your pastors to be living in your neighborhoods. You want them to be accessible there. You want them to, number three, you want them to be able to live in a way that allows them to develop relationships with people outside the church. And so that's why you're making sure that you can cover the cost of soccer, so they can meet with other parents, that they can go and they can volunteer and do some other activities to be able to develop relationships outside the church in your community. And so if you're able to do that, if you're able to make sure that they're able to kind of cover those costs and live in your neighborhood and lead with generosity, you're doing pretty well. And like I said, you can use tools like your public schools pay scale. You can use tools like datausa.io, churchsalary.com to help you understand what's fair, what's relatively livable for your neighborhood. And then you can also tap into some of the other people in your church. One thing to keep in mind, though, a lot of times churches, we use the language from time to time of, total package or salary plus benefits. Okay. So total package salary that's salary and benefits combined. And then salary plus benefits. If you're doing, a $50,000 a year total package, understand that if you're bringing a family in, it's probably going to be a $30,000 a year salary plus, healthcare, which for a family of four typically runs about $20,000, give or take. And so factor that in as you're having the conversation. Understand that, some of the comparison tools that you're going to be using are salary plus benefits. And so make sure you're using the same language when you do some of that comparison. One last thing just to keep in mind, one of the things that we've been learning here over the last probably 18 months is that a lot of times churches are no longer competing with other churches when it comes to salary and benefits packages. A lot of what we've seen here lately is churches are starting to compete with corporations like Amazon, who it's not a far stretch to be able to expect to make 45,000 or 50,000 a year there with decent benefits starting day one, plus like tuition reimbursement and all that kind of stuff. And one of the neat side effects or side perks of that is that, Jeff Bezos doesn't call on Sunday night after a sermon kind of stepped on his toes or anything like that. So keep in mind, one of the things that's really kind of radically shifted over the last 18 months is that churches are no longer competing against each other when it comes to salaries, but now people are starting to look outside of the church and say, hey, I could probably make the same amount of money with less stress and care better for my family through this. And so that's one of the things that we want to kind of keep in mind as we do this. So that's some quick hits as far as what to be thinking about salary wise now in the midst of the way things have changed over the last 2 years in the middle of the inflation spike that we're starting to see. Hope that's helpful. Would love to hear any thoughts that you had, anything that you wish we had spoken to on this.